Good evening. My name is Harvey Kirk. Tonight we present the second program in our series, The Soviets at the Crossroads. In southern Africa, a bloody civil war has been raging now for 14 years. A Marxist government in Angola, backed by Soviet arms and Cuban manpower, has fought a persistent challenge from guerrillas backed by the South African and the U.S. governments. It started in 1974, when the Portuguese suddenly abandoned their colonies, presenting the Soviet Union with a totally unexpected opportunity. Democratic elections were promised, but they were never held. Within months, a communist regime was in power, supported by 12,000 Cuban troops. Angola was the first country in southern Africa to fall under Soviet control, but a Cuban army and an arsenal of Soviet weapons are needed to keep the Angolan government in power. Tonight you will learn how a conspiracy to turn Angola over to a Soviet-backed regime launched the Soviet adventure in Africa.
In the first briefings of the National Security Council, the CI director going in with an aide, a colonel with him with charts and maps, was saying, "Gentlemen, this is a map of Africa, and here is Angola. In Angola, there are three liberation movements. There's the FNLA, headed by Holden Roberto. They're the good guys. We've dealt with him for some time. There's the MPLA, headed by Agostinho Neto, who's a drunken, psychotic poet with a Marxist background. They're the bad guys." And they used exactly that terminology, the good guys and the bad guys, so these people on the National Security Council could get it straight what the game was.
There's no way that the MPLA government can survive without Soviet hardware and Cuban manpower. This means that the Soviets can use Angola in a number of different ways. It gives them a client that cannot say no.
What I don't think many Cubans foresaw, including Fidel Castro, was that this involvement in Angola would be prolonged, that from this initial war, quote, war of national liberation, it became a war of occupation 10, 11 years later. That the Cubans are themselves involved in a quagmire, much like the United States was in a quagmire in Vietnam.
In the southwest section of the African continent lies the nation of Angola. From 1600 to 1975, it was the pearl of the Portuguese colonial empire. Beneath its soil lies the riches of King Solomon's mines, diamonds, gold, and platinum. But now, its soil is drenched in blood, for Angola is a land at war, the longest civil war in Africa. This once fertile land has become impoverished. It is a land of death, disease, and starvation. It is also the focus of a superpower confrontation in southern Africa. Tonight you will meet those responsible for Angola's tragedy and those who claim to offer hope for its future. You will meet Juan Benameles, a Cuban defector who specialized in subversion in Africa. John Stockwell, the head of the CIA's Angolan task force. Jonas Savimbi, the guerrilla leader of UNITA, Angola's resistance movement. And the Red Admiral, Rosa Coutinho, the Portuguese official who orchestrated a decade of bloody civil war.
Well, I must say that in Angola, I started what we could call the decolonization process. Because this started only when I arrived there. And, well, I had this kind of job just during 6 months. But I think that I fixed the decolonization process in an irreversible way.
Appointed High Commissioner of the Portuguese colony in 1975, Admiral Rosa Coutinho was the most powerful man in Angola. We found him in the Portuguese capital of Lisbon. After 10 years of silence, Rosa Coutinho finally agreed to an interview.
Well, I was, first of all, head of all military forces. I was the commander-in-chief. Second, I was the executive, the head of the administrative branch. Let's say I had a government, I formed the government, and I directed the government.
You had lots of influence.
Certainly, I had the influence and I exerted it.
Yeah, you exercised it.
Yes, I am not Platonic.
In 1974, Angola was promised independence from Portugal. Rosa Coutinho was put in charge of the negotiations. Portugal had fought a long and brutal war in an attempt to retain its resource-rich colonies. For 10 years, 3 opposing guerrilla movements had fought the Portuguese for the liberation of Angola. The Soviet-supported MPLA, headed by Agostinho Neto. The FNLA, headed by Holden Roberto and backed by the United States. And UNITA, led by Jonas Savimbi. Rosa Coutinho favored the MPLA and devised a scheme to put them in power. All 3 guerrilla leaders were invited to Alvor in Portugal. Each of them agreed to democratic elections under Portuguese supervision. And to great acclaim, the Alvor Agreement was heralded as the cornerstone of Angola's future. But Alvor was a fraud. The elections were never meant to take place.
And I knew very well that elections could not be held on the territory during the time that lapsed, because Angola was still in a kind of turmoil. And if elections would be held, it will be a fantasy. I have stated that at that time, the only solution was to recognize the MPLA was the only force capable of directing Angola. And the Portugal should make a separate agreement with the MPLA and transfer the power to MPLA on the fixed date of 11 November.
But before the MPLA could consolidate its power, an election in Portugal stripped Rosa Coutinho of his influence. The MPLA and Rosa Coutinho turned to Fidel Castro for military aid. Juan Benameles is a former African affairs specialist with the Cuban Foreign Ministry.
In June, there was a meeting in Havana. In June 1975, between General Carlos Fabias, Colonel Varela Gomez, and Rosa Coutinho, they went to Havana. And they had a meeting with Senén Casas Regueiro, Chief of Army Staff, with Julio Casas Regueiro, Chief of Logistics of Cuban Army, with Vecino Alegret, who was after one of the generals who acted in Angola, who the Rear Admiral of the Cuban Navy, Emilio Baez. And it was already a military meeting. I'm talking June 1975. A meeting headed by Rosa Coutinho in Havana with the high Cuban military in order to develop the military help that the Soviets were providing and the Cubans in a way that will facilitate at the 11th of November 1975 the power to the MPLA.
I spent most of my time in Havana, well, having talks with the people, on the ministers. I was interested especially on education and justice.
So from June, July, August, already the discussion of the big, heavily Cuba-Soviet involvement was taking place between the Cubans, the Soviets, and the Portuguese. And in all this mess, Rosa Coutinho was mixed and was a key factor.
Each of the three groups reflected different tribal alliances. The FNLA controlled the north. The MPLA held Luanda, Angola's capital, and UNITA, representing Angola's largest tribe, nearly half of Angola's population, held the south and central region. Bruce Porter, former economics officer with the American consulate in Luanda, had direct dealings with the MPLA.
And the MPLA military leaders said, "You don't really believe there are going to be elections, do you?" Now, this was at the same time MPLA and everybody else was saying there were going to be elections. And we looked at him and we said, "Well, yes, why shouldn't we believe it?" And he said, "Well, because we'd lose." And it was just that simple.
While Bruce Porter was sending back dispatches from Luanda, Angola's capital, the CIA had sent for John Stockwell, just out of Vietnam as officer in charge of Tay Ninh province, to lead another operation.
So they took me down to Washington after 3 months to the day after we left Saigon. The first plane load of arms went into Angola. And they called me up and flew me down in a hurry and told me that the communists were making a big move again in Angola and that Kissinger wasn't going to let them get by with it, and that the CI had been ordered to stop them because of the political situation. The U.S. Army couldn't do it. We had to do it secretly. It was the most sensitive, one of the biggest operations in CI history and the most sensitive one in recent years. It was a fabulous break to my career, but I was being put in charge of this thing. I was the chief of the Angola task force. I would sit on a subcommittee of the National Security Council and I would manage this global program that focused into saving Angola.
Angola was also the focus of Fidel Castro's aspirations. In 1976, he claimed that a recent Cuban expeditionary force was a direct response to a South African invasion of Angola.
We have the proof that at least the regular units with artillery and tanks began the invasion on the 23rd of October. The first Cuban unit arrived between the 5th and the 10th of November, after the invasion by South Africa had taken place.
But in fact, Cuban troops had begun landing in Angola in mid-September, a full month before the South Africans crossed the border. Luis Echegoyen was among the first Cubans spirited into Angola.
We were called up for an important mission. Our training lasted 45 days and we left for Angola on September 18th. We were flown in as tourists, around 150 combat troops, 8 to 10 officials, some lieutenants, and a colonel who was in command.
Echegoyen and the others arrived in Angola in civilian dress, unarmed, and registered at the Hotel Presidente in Luanda.
The first direct evidence that those of us in Luanda had that Cubans were actually in Luanda came about in a very strange way. A Cuban American working for an American bank in Angola was walking past the reception desk of his hotel. He saw a young girl with 7 or 8 young males, all of whom were exceedingly fit, all about the same age, and with short haircuts. And it immediately occurred to him that there was something strange about this group. They didn't speak Portuguese, so he sidled up to the reception desk and he saw their Cuban passports.
The next day, when we got to the outskirts of Luanda to a military camp, they gave us uniforms, took away our suitcases, and gave us Soviet guns.
And in September, the Cubans brought in 700 regular Army troops, not advisors, but regular Army soldiers. In late September, and then in October, we brought in the South African Armored Column. And then the Cubans responded by establishing a bridge and bringing in what eventually totaled 40,000 troops with tanks and jets and everything.
But even now, over a decade after the fact and in the wake of peace talks, Castro continues to claim that the 50,000 Cubans in Angola today were a response to South African aggression.
Cannot do anything fairer than to help the Angolan people.
Históricamente está probado
Historically, it has been proved
de que
that
fueron los surafricanos
it was the South
y
Africans
las tropas de Zaire las que
and the Zaire
iniciaron la
troops
invasión de Angola.
who began Angola's invasion.
Cronológicamente.
So, chronologically.
This is General Rafael Del Pino. He and his family live under the protection of U.S. Marshals, and his voice and appearance have been disguised. This exclusive interview took place in a Washington safe house. As the former commander of the Cuban Air Forces in Angola, General Del Pino refutes President Castro's justification for sending troops to Angola.
We went into Angola in the mid-1975, first with a few hundred advisors. Then we continued increasing the military personnel until the first day of October.
On the 1st of October, how large was your army?
We had about 2,000 men, and the South Africans started their penetration into Angolan territory on the 23rd of October.
With the aid of the 2,000 Cuban troops, the MPLA was able to extinguish an FNLA challenge for Luanda. In the old colonial capital, the MPLA had become, as Rosa Coutinho intended, the successors to the Portuguese. But UNITA would make its stand here, in the countryside. And although Jonas Savimbi was supported by the majority of Angolan people, they stood alone. UNITA was overlooked by the Americans.
Nobody knew much about Savimbi. Savimbi didn't hit the international cocktail circuit the way FNLA and MPLA activists and leaders did. Savimbi stayed in Angola tending to his business.
The program began in July. By early August, I had been brought up and was putting my staff together, and we inside the CIA didn't know who our players were and the geography and whatnot. Savimbi was an afterthought. We really hadn't ever met him until August of '75, until the thing was actually already moving. And then we found he had a history of not being sympathetic to the United States, but he found himself odd man out. He found himself with no backers. The MPLA had gotten support, the commitment from the Russians and then from the Cubans, and the FNLA had the United States and Red China supplying it with arms. And Savimbi was odd man out. I found UNITA's forces not well armed. They didn't have boots, for example. But the great hope that I saw there was a commitment, a willingness to die. If you're in a military situation, this is an essential ingredient, however gory it might be. But also a quality of integrity and charisma on the part of Savimbi, the leader.
Savimbi had the manpower. He had the young men who would go out and fight. What he didn't have were guns. He didn't have logistics capability. He didn't have armor. He didn't have communications. All of those he was able to get from the South Africans in the form of a very small number, a few hundred men, and a few dozen vehicles. That combination was able to defeat Soviet equipment, Soviet advisors, and Cuban manpower on a better than one-to-one basis.
After the battle for Luanda, the FNLA was decimated and ceased to be a viable force. the Americans found themselves drawn into support for UNITA and an association with South Africa.
South Africa's interest in Angola was their own interest to stop the MPLA from gaining power, to stop the Cubans. But at a different level, they were delighted to become involved with the United States to seduce us into a situation of military involvement with them, which they hoped would eventually trap us in a position where we would have to publicly support them in a military venture in Africa. This would commit us to overt support to their policies. The United States finessed this point and drew back and actually gave up and accepted a defeat in Angola rather than taking that step.
Issue as far as the administration is concerned.
The Angolan conflict escalated rapidly, exposing the CIA's activities. Questions arose, first in the media and then in Congress, about U.S. involvement in Angola. In a post-Vietnam isolationist mood, an angry U.S. Senate passed the Clark Amendment, prohibiting further American intervention in Angola.
The Senate voted against U.S. involvement, thinking that we were, in the words of one of them, backing the wrong horse. Actually, we were backing the right horse. We were backing the group that had the majority support of the Angolan people, and we were backing the group that was actually winning the war. The Senate really snatched defeat from the jaws of victory.
The Clark Amendment sealed UNITA's fate. For the second time that year, America was abandoning an ally. Without U.S. backing, South Africa withdrew its forces, and UNITA was left once again to face the full might of Soviet, Cuban, and MPLA forces, alone. Overwhelmed, UNITA retreated on foot from its stronghold in the fertile highlands of central Angola to the forbidding barrens known as the end of the world. For 4 months, battered by daily attacks, ravaged by starvation and disease, UNITA's barefoot forces dwindled and then seemed to vanish into the trackless forests. On the first anniversary of Angolan independence, the MPLA announced UNITA's extinction. Temporarily secure from internal strife, the MPLA began to consolidate its power under President Agostinho Neto. The Portuguese withdrawal had left Angola with a tentative economic infrastructure. Forced to rely heavily on Soviet support, NATO began to centralize and nationalize to match the Soviet model. East Germans began to organize Angola's repressive security apparatus, and other East Bloc advisors flooded into Luanda in an attempt to stabilize the situation. But despite these measures, the economy collapsed further. NATO, beginning to waver in his enthusiasm for Soviet policies, looked to the West for alternatives to Angola's total dependence on the East Bloc. But in 1979, before he was able to establish any economic ties with the West, he died.
Viva o camarada presidente José Eduardo dos Santos! Viva o camarada presidente José Eduardo dos Santos!
His replacement was Eduardo dos Santos, handpicked by Moscow and educated in the Soviet Union. Dos Santos moved Angola closer to a regime committed to Soviet-style socialism, further tightening Moscow's hold on the MPLA. But the economy never recovered. The decayed state of Angolan cities is not the result of war. The war zone is to the south and east and is mainly rural. Angola's cities reflect, to some extent, the sudden withdrawal of the Portuguese. But increasingly, lack of investment combined with agricultural mismanagement, neglect, and an unwieldy bureaucracy is to blame. Nothing is replaced. Nothing is repaired. What money there is goes to arms and services the country cannot sustain. Tadeusz Kurczarski was the Polish trade and commercial attaché in Luanda from 1978 to 1983.
At the time when I was in Luanda, the Soviets provided arms and munitions. The Cubans provided their troops, about 30,000. East Germans provided expertise in security matters to the police and to the armed forces. Bulgarians were dealing with agriculture.
State farms, collectivization, and nationalization have failed to revitalize the country's economic life. Its cities are crumbling, its factories silent. Its streets, littered with refuse, are for some the only means of survival. Once able to export its agricultural surplus, Angola now is the third largest recipient of Red Cross assistance in Africa.
I didn't have to come to Angola to realize that the Soviet model of economy doesn't work. I knew it from Poland and from other countries. The situation in which Angola existed after the independence, taken together with the Soviet model of economy, was a guarantee of disaster.
Its power based in the larger cities, the MPLA's policies favor the urban population. The individual farmer, tribal traditions, and the strength of the church came under attack as the MPLA monopolized power within the party. The announcement of UNITA's demise proved to be premature. Out of range of the enemy, Jonas Savimbi regrouped his forces and now directs a growing army in a renewed civil war. We had an opportunity to see Angola firsthand. Our crew flew into Jamba, UNITA's headquarters, flying at treetop levels to avoid radar and SAM-7 anti-aircraft missiles. From where we landed, UNITA's headquarters was still a long and arduous trek through the unmarked bush of the African veldt. Savimbi explained how he came here to Jamba.
The long march was what happened in May 1976. When we had retreated from all the towns, we had to meet somewhere to try to reorganize. We were 2,000 men. But immediately we were attacked by Cubans, by Russians, and by MPLA, and we were pushed for 4 months. And from May, in October, when we reached a safe place in Kwele, we were 64 persons. Other people from 2,000, the rest of the people were died, they were killed. Others, I think, because of starvation, also they died. And I think the 64 that have survived, I have to admit that most of them were women. Women resisted much more than men. And men, also some few young men are here, but women have resisted much more than men.
Soviet and Cuban MiGs do not have the range to reach this extreme southern tip of Angola. Here, in a former hunting preserve of the Portuguese, UNITA began first to build Jamba, and then to rebuild its army. Although built with only the most basic materials, a self-contained society has emerged. During the time we spent here, we met doctors, surgeons, teachers, and other professionals who told us that they had come either to flee the war, to seek refuge from the government, or because of a commitment to UNITA's stated goal of an Angola free of outside intervention. We saw workshops where captured weapons were repaired for reuse. In those years since the Long March, UNITA has built a disciplined army. More than 40,000 regular troops, able to move in the government-held north as well as the south. We accompanied a patrol in the northern provinces. Supported by the local population who are disenchanted with the central government, UNITA's troops travel lightly, depending on villagers to provide food. We had been awakened at 3 a.m. and told to be ready to travel in 10 minutes. We were taken to an underground bunker, a UNITA war room, for a briefing that would describe the forces that were arrayed against them.
Military presence in Angola is concerned. Apart the Soviets, there are 2,500 East Germans, and the East Germans play a very...
Despite the Cuban and East Bloc troops and the billions of dollars of sophisticated Soviet weaponry, Savimbi says that the morale of his people has never been better.
But for the fact that our soldiers, the morale is very, very high. And yesterday I was speaking to a friend when I said that the crates coming from Soviet Union, they are bringing in MiGs and tanks, but they're not bringing in morale. The morale is with our people.
During the Reagan administration, the U.S. again began supporting UNITA. But UNITA's only dependable support had been the South Africans, who, like Savimbi, have an interest in seeing the Cubans withdraw. They provided air support, and on several occasions crossed the border to indicate to the Soviet and Cuban leaders that they will not let UNITA suffer a final military defeat. The MPLA has had to rely even more on the Cubans, a political liability that Savimbi has turned to his advantage among Angolans who see the Cubans as an occupation force. Pedro Van Dunham, a senior member of the MPLA Central Committee, defends the Cuban presence.
In reality, the Cuban troops are here because of the friendship between our two nations, our two sovereign countries. They are here to help us confront the external aggressor, directed by South Africa and the United States.
In the fall of 1987, the MPLA, along with Cuban and Soviet troops, launched the most massive offensive of the war in an attempt to take Jamba. In one of the largest battles in southern Africa since the Second World War, the Cubans failed to take their objective. Castro publicly blamed Soviet tactics for the defeat.
The forces of the Angolan government are inefficient because the ones in command are the Cubans. If the Cubans were to leave Angola, it is possible that in 24 hours Savimbi would be in Luanda, dining at the Hotel Panorama. The average Angolan soldier has no morale, and many of the MPLA forces are Savimbi spies. We went on a mission to the south with an Angolan guide and were ambushed by UNITA. The battle lasted 2 hours. Out of 200 men, 70 survived and the guide disappeared. We didn't know if he was swallowed up by the earth or what. Later we found out that it had been a trap and that our guide was a spy.
UNITA's policy of disrupting the Angolan economy means that industry and transportation are prime targets. The trade in diamonds, once one of Angola's most profitable exports, has been cut to a trickle. From its base in Jamba, UNITA attacked the town of Andrada in northeastern Angola, once the site of Angola's most productive mines. But the MPLA refused to acknowledge UNITA's capability.
There has just been an attack against our mines in Andrada, and UNITA forces have claimed responsibility. But it was really the South African Army.
Reassured that the MPLA were not monitoring our interview, Anand Imadar, a Canadian living in Andrada, who was injured during the MPLA's counterattack, confirmed that the attack was from UNITA, not South Africa.
Are there any security people here just now? No, they aren't. So I can sort of say what I want to say. They didn't have, frankly, they didn't have any security on the mine at all throughout the day. And at night, when I spent the night there with 60-odd UNITA soldiers. I mean, they were all eating and barbecuing and music going on.
There was no sightings for the whole first day? There were no Angolan troops? Or
nothing. There was no security at all the first whole day. Nothing.
Angola has remained a mystery. The conflict has discouraged witnesses from the outside. American Baptist minister Willie Smith decided to experience Angola firsthand. Once inside, he was confronted by the face of the Angolan War.
The Cubans just moved right in. They came up to the edge of the village, and the next thing, they began to hit the hospital with heavy artillery, like mortar fire. And the people in the hospital were just were scattered. There were nurses in the hospital, and they were killed. The whole thing was just one real tragedy brought on by the Cubans, completely insensitive to the target. Who would bomb a hospital? Who would bomb a church? Who would bomb a school? Who would bomb a mission? That doesn't even seem like it's in the act of war as far as I'm concerned.
Major Robert Nagongo is an MPLA military spokesman.
All I can tell you is that we have created the conditions necessary to destroy the puppet group of UNITA. The final assault, there is no final assault. We are engaged in a permanent struggle.
Beyond the military struggle, there is another battle raging. This one is for the minds of Angola's children. The single and final goal of education is to sow the seeds of allegiance to the revolution. The most promising children are selected for special education. Forcibly taken from their homes or schools, they are brought here, 20 miles off the coast of Cuba, to the Isle of Pines, or as it is also known, the Isle of Youth. Here, they remain for as many as 15 years. Thousands of miles away from home, a half a world away from family and culture, they are free to be molded into the future of Angola as a vision impressed upon them by their Cuban and Soviet mentors. Jorge de Cayasunga is the former governor of Benguela province.
The Cubans, with the collusion of the MPLA government, have taken about 15,000 young Angolan kids, 10, 12 years old, to Cuba.
para Cuba, a tal chamada Ilha de Cuba.
Young people are sent to transform them to the Cuban way of thinking and have instilled in them communist theory. After this transformation and political training, they are sent back to help in the construction of a socialist republic.
E o MPLA pensa que esses jovens transformados depois voltam para facilitarem a construção do socialismo em Angola.
Now they have their very young people coming from Africa. They teach them, there's very young people, very easily to assimilate without questioning the ideology that is imparted by the government or by African Marxist instructors that came with them.
Down imperialism! Down! Down fascism! Down! Down fascism! Down! Down regionalism! Down! Down fascism! Down! A luta! A luta! A vitória! Patria muerte! Patria muerte! Más fuerte! Patria muerte!
It was the 2nd of November 1984 when the Cubans came to our village. I tried to stop the Cubans from taking my son, my child, away. Then one of the Cubans cut off my arm with his bayonet. They were capturing the children from the age of 10 and upwards to take them to Cuba.
And your son, how old is he?
He was 12 when he was taken away.
O povo angolano chora hoje em dia. O povo angolano só implora harmonia. Condena russos e cubanos. Terror de todo o povo angolano. E por causa da confusão que até agora tem crescido, e por causa do mercenarismo dos cubanos reis do terrorismo. Lara, 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 lara.
With the collapse of the coffee and mining industry, oil has become Angola's principal source of hard currency. Ironically, the Marxist MPLA's major partner is the U.S. petroleum giant Chevron Gulf. The partnership began under the Portuguese and continues under the MPLA. Royalties from Western corporations maintain the government in power, providing the money needed to pay for Cuban troops and Soviet guns.
February of 1976, Gulf was back in, pumping the oil again, with Cuban soldiers protecting their installation and their technicians to defend them from CI mercenaries who were still mucking around northern Angola. Try that for an irony.
The real thing is that the MPLA stays in power because of this financial income. From this financial income depends the presence of the Cubans and the Soviet hardware, military hardware.
Luis Negrete was the director of Cuba's automotive industry until his recent defection in Spain.
The first pact to exchange military technology between Angola and Cuba was signed in 1979. A price was set. The Angolan government had to pay for each man sent to Angola as well as his upkeep. This means that Cuba profits greatly for this internationalist aid it lends Angola. It's a big business where the Cuban government makes big profits.
The Cubans are not the only ones to profit in Angola. Texaco, General Tire, the Chase Manhattan Bank, and IBM all participate in over $1 billion in annual U.S. Angolan trade. But with hundreds of millions of dollars in assets, Chevron Gulf is one of the single largest Western investors in Angola. Will Lewis is the manager of Chevron Gulf's oil concession in Angola.
Chevron has no intention of pulling out of Angola. We intend to continue to do business as usual, fulfill all the terms of our contract over here, and in fact, subject to termination of our current negotiations, successful termination, then we intend to expand our operations into the new concession area.
Some Western governments have justified stronger economic ties with Angola because with them would come an opportunity to bring about change.
Never the economic aid or the economic assistance will change the nature of a Marxist government to a democratic government. No, I never saw that case, that the Marxist government, a Marxist party, a communist party, will change its nature because you will be $10 billion more.
Cuba's third world, not aligned status has provided the Soviets with a perfect partner in Africa and Latin America.
Cuba has played the role of a surrogate like no other Soviet ally could play. It is itself a third world country. Fidel Castro himself is a third world leader and has had a tremendous international visibility. So Cuba has been extremely important in playing a role that no other Soviet ally could play. And in turn, Fidel Castro has been willing to play that role. He's been willing to dispatch Cuban combat troops to Angola, 36,000 to Angola, 12,000 to Ethiopia, 1977, 1978. This in turn has advanced, of course, Soviet objectives in Southern Africa and in the Horn of Africa. But Fidel Castro has also been able to further his own ambitions.
Logistically, the Cuban army depends totally from Soviet Union. Castro can develop a guerrilla warfare by its own, but he cannot move a military unit by his own. And that's the difference. You can call it coordination, you can call it what you like, but he cannot do it without the consent. Who will have a strategic aspiration in Africa? The Soviets, not the Cubans. So if the Cubans are acting, it's because they are acting in favor of the Soviets, you know. That's why they are in Ethiopia and in South Yemen, in Bab el-Mandeb. That's why they are in Angola, you know. And they are very useful for the Soviets.
But Castro's military adventures have exacted a high price, both at home and abroad.
When we would go out on the streets, Angolans would spit on us and call us dirty communists. You are here to colonialize us. All you have brought is death, destruction, and misery. We would ask ourselves, what are we doing here? An entire cemetery of Cubans have died. But we could not leave because the Soviets gave the orders and the Cubans gave the blood, the arms.
When a person dies in Angola in combat, the family knows it maybe 1 year and a half after he dies. And he does not, and the family does not know, never, how he died. They said he fell from a truck, he died in a car accident, never combat bullet is mentioned. But the amount of people who die in Angola in car crashes and falling from trucks, you know, is incredible.
Throughout the Third World, Cuban advisors have become an instrument of Soviet foreign policy.
I was in South Yemen as advisor, and I was giving orders, the same as the rest of the Cubans were doing in South Yemen, and the same as the Cubans are doing in Angola. We were giving orders. They have to do it.
I think if you go back and look at what the Soviets have been doing in Africa for the last 20 or 25 years, they haven't done too well. You can think of 2 or 3 countries where the Soviets tried to get a pretty tight grip and failed. What the Soviets were, the opportunity the Soviets were presented with in Angola was a situation whereby going in and supporting one side in a civil war made them indispensable. There's no way that the MPLA government can survive without Soviet hardware and Cuban manpower. This means that the Soviets can use Angola in a number of different ways. It gives them a client that cannot say no. And this is something that they have never had before.
It was Fidel Castro, as much as the Soviets, who saw the opportunity in Angola. Although there is talk of withdrawal, strategically, Angola will remain a critical Soviet foothold in Africa. Its proximity to South Africa could make it a central player in the future of South Africa. From here, the Cubans and the Soviets launched Africa's biggest airlift to Ethiopia in 1978. Cuba's Angolan troops were the world's first rapid deployment force. 15,000 more Cuban troops landed in Angola to be deployed during the Battle of Cuito Cardinal, only to be bombarded by massive South African artillery. It was becoming evident to Moscow that the stakes were too high. The commitment to Angola is proving to be of questionable value, and the toll of foreign wars has brought a new criticism within the Soviet Union itself. With the Mujahideen on the offensive in Afghanistan, the increasing problems facing the Soviet-backed government in Ethiopia, UNITA maintaining its strength, the Soviet Union is at a crossroads. It must make a choice between financing foreign wars or improving life back home. Once the champions of anti-colonialist forces, the Soviets themselves are now the target. The stalemate has brought with it peace talks, but UNITA, always the odd one out, has never been a player in negotiations. Although Cuba, South Africa, the MPLA, and the US have agreed on terms of disengagement, they will have to come to a resolution with UNITA and the majority it represents. With Soviet resolve softening, the Angolan economy collapsing, Jonas Savimbi has renewed the call to fulfill the promise of elections in the Alvor Agreement.
We want elections, free elections. And if observers from the United Nations, from the OAU, from any free country can come, better for us. And if UNITA is beaten in the polls and they want to pick up guns again, then they are bandits. But I am confident that we will win the elections.
If the democratic ideal of representative government has any meaning in Southern Africa, it must include the people of Angola. Successfully overthrowing the mantle of Portuguese domination, they suffer under a new kind of colonialism. For 29 years, Angolans have fought for independence. UNITA is committed to the struggle until they win their right to participate in open and free elections. On January 10, 1989, Cuban troops began to leave Luanda, the capital of Angola, in the first stages of a 2-year withdrawal. At the same time, South African troops have pulled back from Angola's borders. Jonas Savimbi was left out of the negotiated settlement. Abandoned before by earlier allies, he vows to keep fighting until democratic elections are held. The terrible tragedy in Angola has never commanded world attention, partly because another Marxist experiment in Africa, backed by the Soviet Union, continues to bring about suffering on an even more massive scale. 7 million people barely survived the last Ethiopian famine. Even more are at risk today. On our next program, Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa.